Here is a recording of the live water resources outlook we did earlier today. And what we talked about a little bit was, will the drought spread in the southeast? And who is most vulnerable in late summer and fall? And what does the tropical season mean for water resources in the southeast? These answers and more in this edition of the Water Resources Outlook.
So let's look at where we are, and when we look at the 30-day departure from normal for precipitation, we see a lot of those yellow, orange, and even red colors across the region, especially across the southern Appalachians, indicating deficits in rainfall. Some of these deficits 2 to 4 inches in the orange hues you see. This really is the majority of the area, with only pockets of above normal rainfall. Primarily, those pockets are in the Florida Peninsula there and coastal regions of the Carolinas and Virginia. Looking at the year-to-date departures and precipitation, we see a few very distinct areas, one being the wet weather they've had out there in Texas and the lower Mississippi River Valley. This has led to some considerable flooding out there this year. Another area is the wetness in the Florida Peninsula. This was primarily due to a very wet January and very wet May here. And finally, we see the very distinct dryness bullseye in the southern Appalachians, where deficits for the year there, as you can see indicated by the orange and red colors, are between 6 inches and as high as 12 inches or more in some spots. So what has this done to stream flows? We see the stream flows match the precipitation fairly well, with near to above normal in the Florida Peninsula and eastern North Carolina, and then below normal in the upper Alabama, Chattahoochee, and upper Savannah and upper Altamaha River basins. This also matches up well with the latest drought monitor as of June 21st, with severe drought D2 conditions now across a large portion of the southern Appalachians. So for Georgia, we have about half the state in unusually dry conditions and about a third of the state now in drought, with 15% in severe drought. This fast-growing drought is definitely having some effects as well on agriculture in North Georgia already. Again, as we see with very dry conditions and above normal temperatures, the drought is rapidly developing in some areas. In late March, we had no drought, but in 3 months now, we see 40% of Alabama in drought and about a third of Georgia in drought, so something we'll be watching here at the Southeast River Forecast Center. So let's jump now to the tropical season, which could be one possibility for alleviating drought, a tropical storm. But let's look at what is typical, the typical number of storms that affect the southeast each year, potentially bringing flooding. Typically, as you see in the chart there, we see about 1 to 4 storms each year. There's a smaller chance to see 0 as well as 5 or more. But of the many storms that originate in the Atlantic Basin, which is that giant yellow area you see, how many eventually do affect the southeast with heavy rainfall? We see that last year we had 11 storms, but only 2 affected the southeast, Anna in May and Claudette in July. You could say there was 3, as we had Joaquin in late September. That indirectly affected South Carolina with all the heavy rain and flooding, but actually Joaquin was fairly far from the U.S. coastline, rather a synoptic pattern that set this heavy rain up event tied to Joaquin. This year we've had 4 storms in the Atlantic Basin, and actually 2 have already affected the southeast, and Chris will talk about this later. So on average, about a quarter of the Atlantic Basin storms affect the southeast.
All right, I'd like to begin my portion of the tropical discussion by looking at what tropical systems have already formed for the 2016 season. We started the season in kind of an unusual way. The first named storm of the season was Alex, and that was all the way back in January, which is a bit unusual. This was a storm that started as a subtropical system, but it gathered strength and eventually gained winds that were that of a hurricane, so it gained hurricane status, and it's been the only hurricane so far of the 2016 season. The other 3 named storms all eventually reached tropical storm status. The second storm of the season was Bonnie, and that one also formed early. It was just shy of the beginning of the official hurricane season, starting on June 1st. We've had 2 more named systems since then, and of those formed named storms, 2 of those 4 have impacted the southeast U.S. That's Bonnie and Colin. If and when there's a fifth named storm, that will be named Earl. Looking at the next 5 days, we're not seeing anything out there right now that would qualify as a tropical cyclone, and we're not expecting anything to form through these next 5 days. Just wanted to take a look at sea surface temperatures out there right now. Typically, we see tropical systems form in over ocean waters that are 80 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer, and in this image, that's basically where you see orange shading or hotter colors. So as we go east through the Atlantic, we see those cooler colors, yellow being just shy of that 80-degree mark. So this gives us a better idea of where in the near term we would expect any forms that could form. Now switch gears, I just want to talk about what we can expect the next few days across the southeast U.S. Right now we're seeing a cold front starting to move southeastward across the area. And by Wednesday, we expect this cold front to basically be along the Carolina coast. As we get towards the end of the week, we're expecting that front to stall out as a stationary front, and then by Friday move ever so slightly northward in response to another system that's approaching the region. Going into this weekend, we're expecting that front to get a bit closer to us, and then by the time we go into Sunday and the holiday on Monday, the models really start to diverge and give very different impressions of what we can expect out at this range. Now, granted, it is a week out there now, but we haven't seen the models diverge quite like this in a while. Looking at the 7-day precipitation forecast as of today, we see impact from both of those fronts. So the front that's be moving through the area shortly and contributing to those QPF precipitation amounts along the Carolina coast and south into Georgia, Alabama, and then up in Tennessee and then over to North Carolina and Virginia. We see the impact that we're expecting from that second front.
Thanks, Chris. You know, typical June and July formation areas for tropical systems in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean are shown here. Sea surface temperatures need to be warm enough for these storms to develop. Many times, especially early in the season, frontal systems will move into the Gulf or push off the Atlantic coast. Storms can form as those systems stall and thunderstorms remain in the area. It isn't until late July or so that we start looking to the Atlantic for these storms to develop. Once those waves start to pick up off the coast of Africa and the waters are warm enough to support tropical development, that's when we start to see the development in the Atlantic. We will look in a little at how La Nina will impact this season. One thing to add, as in the past years, even if they develop out in these most likely zones, quite often, in fact, as Jeff says, 75% of the time, many of these storms stay out of the southeast. The bottom line is, though, it only takes one. If one of these storms impact your area, it doesn't really matter much if your year has been active or inactive. We need to stay alert to any potential storm that could affect us. Historically speaking, here are where the storms of the last 150 years or so have formed for the end of June and early July. One thing to note before we talk about La Nina and expectations, there have currently been no storms form in the western Pacific Basin so far this year. Just something to note as we look at our forecast for this year. A very big shift from last year's El Nino. We are now talking about La Nina. Temperatures have cooled in the Pacific equatorial region, and our forecast maps are looking very different from last year. La Nina will likely become official in the late summer or early fall, but we could already be feeling the change as noted by mention of no storms in the western Pacific Basin yet this year. Here's a look at the influence that La Nina has on the hurricane season. The Pacific season tends to be more quiet, while the Atlantic hurricane season tends to be more active. With weak vertical shear and less stability in the atmosphere, the basin is ripe for development. Things do have to come together just right to get them to form and then have an impact on our region. As we go through the rest of the season, we will monitor other large-scale circulations, including the North Atlantic Oscillation, anything that might have an impact on the season, but has short forecast potential. The official forecast from the National Hurricane Center for this season shows the best chance for a normal season, which includes named storms 10 to 16, hurricanes 4 to 8, and major hurricanes 1 to 4 for the year. The 1-month outlook from the Climate Prediction Center shows higher than normal chances of above normal rain in South Florida. Currently, as was similar to what Chris mentioned earlier, there's nothing to indicate above or below precipitation for the rest of the area. The seasonal outlook from July through September shows Florida and the Gulf Coast with the best chance for normal rainfall. This would follow pretty closely with what has happened in the last month or so, the exception being the area in the eastern Carolinas and Virginia that has been above normal in some spots and will need to be watched. They show equal chances of above normal and below normal precipitation in that area. The temperature graphic throws another variable into the equation. Above normal temperatures are looking pretty likely over the southeast. This would increase evaporation rates in lakes and out of vegetation. Another reason to be concerned about drought expanding and intensifying over the southeast. So here's an overall look at the Southeast Water Resources expectation through the summer and into early fall. Right now, where the drought area is in northern Alabama and northern Georgia, we expect that possibly to expand a little bit, just as we're very warm at this time and don't expect above average rainfall in these areas. So one of the reasons we show the brown on those rivers through Alabama, Georgia, and on to the coast is that when we don't have enough rainfall at the tops of those basins, it tends to affect those rivers all the way through the basin. Even though we may have some rain at the bottom of those basins, it tends to affect the rivers in those basins. That's the ring. We want people to understand that and know that just because you don't have drought directly in your area, you could be impacted by what was upstream. As for what we've got going on in North Carolina, we've had above normal rainfall in some of those parts, so we're watching that very carefully. We have enough rain in the area where rivers are in pretty good shape. They're pretty normal for this time of year, so a tropical system would impact that area probably a little more than it would in, the South Carolina on through Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. The other area we're concerned about is the Central and South Florida area, which has seen much above normal rainfall both in January and in May this year, and that seems to be continuing as the wet season continues in Florida. Well, now that we have looked at the outlook through September, let's look at the end of the year briefly. Our current CPC forecast is leaning towards below normal precipitation through fall and into the winter. Concern should be growing for drought intensifying across the southeast into the recharge season next winter. We have plenty of time to talk about it. We are just trying to give a little forewarning to you about the possibilities. So the bottom line, in the short term, looks like pop-up thunderstorms associated with weak frontal systems as they move through the southeast. Florida, the wet season is in full swing, which is why we are concerned about that area and are watching it very closely as we move further into wet season. As for the long term, hot and mostly dry in the heart of the southeast, and then wet around the edges with a possibly more active tropical season, certainly more than we've seen the last couple years, but again, we're still not sure how much it will impact the southeast. But again, for the long term, we are really closely watching that area of drought in the center of our area, and to see if it expands and it starts to change the area and starts to really see drought. As for our next Water Resources Outlook, we plan to record it on July 21st. Thank you all for joining us in today's Water Resources Outlook. For those of you who couldn't join us for the live one, we hope you'll be back. We'll plan on doing one sometime, hopefully in December or January, another live one, so we can talk possibly about the recharge season. Thanks again for listening.